Speaking about the dissonance and the disconnect that there is perhaps between energy communities, climate communities, those working on food and water and other issues, what's the problem with having this compartmentalization that we witness in the energy and climate policy field?
Well, as in so many parts of the world, these issues are in reality integrated one with another. But all too often, policymakers and, I'm afraid, academic departments don't see them together. So you have people who are perhaps trained in energy and the extractive industries in the universities, and people on the other hand who are trained in climate change and environmental sciences, but you don't see people having a joint approach to both energy and climate. And that's what policymakers need, and frankly it's what any kind of informed public assumes already exists. I think people are generally quite horrified to discover that there isn't this kind of joined up thinking, because that's what I think they assume that government is for.
So life cycle assessment, environmental impact assessment, the use of these to understand beforehand the impacts of policy, investments, either by government in terms of procurement or by business sector, for natural resources particularly, that these were helping us understand the impacts in a way that is beginning to feed into the mindset of government. Now, I'm only saying that is beginning to. There are real variations across the world. There's an excellent example of Costa Rica, I think. Costa Rica has recognized the interdependence of the impact of economic activity on ecosystems, and how you need to consider the impacts and create fiscal tools to deliver an integrated governance system for management of an economy. So the management of its own use of fossil fuels, the management of its water, the management of its land for agricultural purposes and forestry. There's the emergence of what's known as a global landscape governance. Now, for some people that may only be global landscape without the city, but there's increasingly an understanding that the city is part of the global landscape as well, and the interrelationships between these, both in terms of energy consumption and in terms of emissions. That's why under the one of the Paris outcomes was the reaffirmation of the Nazca, which was the thing I mentioned earlier, where cities, and amongst others like big businesses, are committing to reducing their emissions. So they're establishing policies. Now these will and are beginning to have an effect on the way in which either federal governments or state level governments or national governments are perceiving how they develop policy in different areas.
The reality is that we do have these disparate groups. We do have different agendas. We do have different sources of power. What we need to develop is an understanding at the domestic, regional and international level that there are implications beyond these specific areas, be it environment or energy or climate or manufacturing or business. All of these things, there's an overview that must be taken. That discourse has to begin. That discourse has to be accepted that these things cannot be seen in isolation. We've seen the impact of the globalization of the economy in many positive and negative ways, in both the global north and global south. What we're seeing is the globalization of the impact of energy choices. We need to find new ways of discussing that. And again, I think one of the challenges in the next 5 years will be trialing new ways of communicating, trying new ways of getting policies to align, and it will be a question of trial and error.
One of the difficulties, I think, is that some of the established institutions have self-interest in terms of protecting their territory in terms of influence. I think a really good example is the how the IEA, once the arena was established for renewable energy, it did have an influence on the IEA in terms of they woke up to the fact that renewables was part of energy. But they don't really work in partnership in the way that you would like to see happen. They deliver their own reports, they're trying to encourage investment through different countries and work through different channels. I think another problem is the political division between countries is sort of changing geopolitical. So we're seeing the establishment of new institutions that are focused away from the old centres of power, and that could be really great. You know, like the establishment of the infrastructure bank in Beijing, which the US hasn't been involved in whatsoever. The idea that these new institutions would somehow be better than the old ones, when we're looking at some of these institutions, they're replicating the same kind of model. So they're not really rethinking and delivering a sort of paradigm shift. The Green Climate Fund, which took years to agree with, and was supposed to be taking on board the needs of developing and small island states, and that they decided how the money was going to be used. I mean, in its mission statement, it says that it's at the forefront of a paradigm shift in terms of moving towards a low carbon world. But when you look at how it's functioning already, there's patterns of classic sort of institutional sort of entrenchment of old ideas that getting caught up in classic battles between different donors and how the money's being used, and et cetera, et cetera. There's sort of power struggles. Yeah. So I think governance is always about power, and power is not always related to a good end objective in terms of cooperation. There's all these struggles, and the idea that we sort of seamlessly move towards a sort of cooperative world where the institutions are working together at all levels to achieve the end objectives of a low carbon world. It won't happen like that. It'll be rough, and sometimes it'll feel like we're not getting anywhere. But I think there are pockets where there's new ways of thinking and new ways of approaching things. But it's trying to make space for those to flourish. One of the big hindrances, I think, could be if we do see governments handing over responsibility for establishing governance over energy and energy systems to large-scale business. I think that we won't be seeing a more democratization and empowerment of those that are the poorest at the moment.
Grand strategy, global corporate policy, all of these issues demand comprehensive assessments and comprehensive integrated strategies. It isn't good enough, it never has been, to compartmentalize in this way. The compartmentalization serves old thinking and vested interests, whereas the public and the objective situation require an integrated strategic approach to these issues, so that you should look at employment, industrial policy, national security and foreign policy, and climate policy in an integrated way. And frankly, you know, if policy was a fruit machine, renewable energy, you know, comes up gold on all bars, because in all of these areas you get better foreign policy, you get better national security policy, you get better employment policy, and you deal with climate change. And therefore it's a mistake, if your main concern is climate change, to ignore these other areas. And it's a mistake if you're in international security policy to think that climate issues are simply for tree-hugging Greens. They can have a real impact on international security priorities.
The governance is definitely about a change away from the institutions and rules and systems that we have now to a much more integrated system. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals here are, again, they can easily be knocked for one being voluntary and nobody's held to account if they're not met, etc. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals, the key point is that they're interconnected. So if you're aiming to alleviate completely energy poverty, it has to be done by not increasing climate change. You mustn't undermine the effort to mitigate climate change. You must also not increase deforestation and land degradation. You must also contribute to the education of people and the health and well-being. So there's a way that there is something emerging, and I in my optimistic days, when I have my optimistic days, I think the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, with the political will and the policy commitment spurred on by knowledge entrepreneurs, be they academics or business or civil society, can bring about a transformation in the way in which we perceive and relate to the world. Now that's being really positive and being very optimistic in a time when things are seeming quite bleak. We could talk about the increasing fragmentation in terms of the world, the reduction in apparent cooperation, and we are in a very different world to 1992 when the UNFCCC was agreed, which is a much more, on the surface, a sort of we'd come together. This idea that integration is going to happen using international mechanisms. We didn't get to the Paris Agreement, all the Sustainable Development Goals, without having travelled from 1992. There's been development in thinking and understanding, and yes, we face the reality of politics and conflict and terrorism, but you have to be optimistic, I think, and the optimism is about trying to invest in new ways of understanding about policy around energy and climate, because they are the building blocks for almost everything else.